Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The land is our mother. So when we lose value for the land, people lose value for the women. Thus says Vanessa Gray of Aamjiwnaang First Nation, Ontario, and I agree. It's also my firm belief that, like systemic racism, environmental racism is something that's been ignored for far too many years, and the time has come for us to act to redress the problems of the past and make sure they don't continue. Surely it should be enshrined as a human right for all Canadians to have clean air, water, and earth. I first became aware of the issue of environmental racism 5 years ago when I first met Dr. Ingrid Waldron, a professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax in the School of Nursing, at a coffee shop in Halifax near the provincial legislature where I worked as an MLA. At that time, Dr. Waldron explained what her research and data gathering was proving about the reality of environmental racism in Nova Scotia. I suggested that creating a legislative bill to address the issue would be a help at that point in time and bring it to public awareness and to the floor of government in Nova Scotia. Dr. Waldron and I worked together for several weeks on my very first private member's bill, Bill 111, the Environmental Racism Protection Act, which I introduced in Province House in 2015. Later on, Dr. Waldron wrote a book entitled There's Something in the Water, which highlights environmental racism in Black and Indigenous communities across Nova Scotia, and she recently partnered with Nova Scotian actor Elliot Page to create the 2019 documentary based on that book. Upon my arrival in Ottawa as an MP a year ago, my first personal order of business was to introduce a similar bill, but this time as a national strategy in order to address environmental racism across Canada. The scope of Bill C-230 is therefore broader and more comprehensive than my original provincial bill. Bill C-230 would collect data including socioeconomic circumstances, physical and mental effects of communities affected by environmental racism across this land. These effects are wide-ranging, from skin rashes and upset stomachs to more serious ailments like respiratory illness, including asthma, cardiovascular disease, reproductive morbidity, including preterm births, and babies born with Down syndrome, as well as cancers that disproportionately impact women. There is evidence that many chronic diseases in Indigenous communities, for instance, are not primarily due to genetics or internal factors, but instead to external factors, what is in the air, in the water, in our environment. I'd like to personally thank the member of Saanich Gulf Islands at this time for seconding Bill C-230, and I suggest that this is an example of what Canadians truly want to see in their government, especially in these dangerous times. Parliamentarians working together. I'd like to thank Dr. David Suzuki and the Suzuki Foundation, the Blue Dot Movement, and the Enrich Project for their endorsement and support for this vital bill. And I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Dr. Ingrid Waldron for her passion, dedication, research, assiduous study, and for sharing her notes for me this evening, because environmental racism and its effects on racialized communities needs to be heard by everybody. So, Mr. Speaker, as MP for Cumberland Colchester, I would like to explain what environmental racism is. It refers to the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities to polluting industries and other environmental hazards. These toxic burdens have been linked to high rates of cancer, as I've said, and other health problems in these communities. From the decision approximately 60 years ago to offload pulp mill effluent into Pictou Landing First Nations' once pristine boat harbor, and toxic landfills and dumps placed in the African Nova Scotian communities of Shelburne, Lincolnville, and Africville, to mercury contamination in Grassy Narrows First Nation, petrochemical facilities in Chemical Valley in Ontario and in British Columbia, and the legacy of environmental racism really can no longer be ignored. Bill C-230 is asking the Minister of Environment and Climate Change to develop a strategy that must include measures to examine the link between race, socioeconomic status, and environmental risk, collect by environmental racism, assess the administration and enforcement of environmental laws in each province, and address environmental racism, including in relation to possible amendments to federal laws, policies, and programs, the involvement of community groups in environmental policymaking, compensation for individuals or communities, ongoing funding for affected communities, and access of affected communities to clean air and water. Mr. Speaker, I would contend that Indigenous and Black women have been building grassroots environmental and social justice movements for decades to challenge the legal, political, and corporate agendas that sanction and enable environmental racism and other forms of colonial violence in their communities. Colonial gendered violence continues today and includes the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the displacement of Indigenous people from their lands by corporate resource extraction projects, anti-Black and anti-Indigenous police violence, and other forms of state-sanctioned violence that make it difficult for Indigenous and Black peoples and women to meet their basic needs with respect to employment, income, healthcare, and other resources. Colonialization and genocide are tied to the intersections of Indigenous lands and bodies. Women experience violence because they are the ones that are responsible for taking care of the land and holding it for future generations. Therefore, gendered violence that harms women specifically also harms nations, which makes it easier to take possession of the land. For Indigenous women specifically, production and reproduction, land and life, resistance and survival are all intimately connected. There is no separation. Therefore, the Indigenous role in fighting against environmental racism by defending their land and territory and protecting their water are acts of resistance against gendered oppression. So, what is environmental racism exactly? How do we define it? Environmental racism is racial discrimination in the disproportionate location and greater exposure of Indigenous and racialized communities to contamination and pollution from polluting industries and other environmentally hazardous activities, as I said, but also in the lack of political power these communities have for resisting the placement of industrial polluters in their communities. In the implementation of policies that sanction the harmful and in many cases life-threatening presence of poisons in these communities. In the disproportionate negative impacts of environmental policies that result in differential rates of cleanup of environmental contaminants in these communities, and in the history of excluding Indigenous and racialized communities from mainstream environmental groups, decision-making boards, commissions, and regulatory bodies. And I would also say in the feminist movement. The health effects of environmental racism in Canada. Wow, the health risks associated include, as I've said, all of these various different types of serious illnesses. And studies provide evidence that health effects of environmental racism are both gendered and racialized and impact Indigenous women in specific ways, most notably the impacts on reproductive health. One of the most significant ways that environmental racism impacts Indigenous women specifically is through the detrimental health effects of toxic contaminants that include high levels of toxins in breast milk, placenta cord blood, blood serum, body fat, as well as infertility, miscarriages, premature births, premature menopause, reproductive system cancers, and an inability to produce healthy children due to compromised endocrine and immune systems while in utero. This bill, Bill C-230, is important, Mr. Speaker. Why is it important? It would play a significant role in addressing the legacy of environmental racism in Canada and ensure that these communities have access to clean air and water, which all Canadians have a right to. It would also help address environmental health inequities in Indigenous and Black communities that are outcomes of these communities' proximity to environmental contamination and pollution. It's up to those with power and not the people impacted by environmental racism to address the problem. Those who have the most influence and the strongest voice need to be part of the solution. It's important that all communities have the power to control their environment, Mr. Speaker. Currently, Indigenous, Black, and other racialized communities, non-white communities, don't have that power. And when they don't have a say in what happens in their communities, we all suffer. Bill C-230 addresses this imbalance of power and benefits everyone. It's good for all of us. It's good for Canada. It would provide an opportunity for the communities most affected by environmental racism to be involved in environmental policymaking. Mr. Speaker, according to a Lincolnville resident in Nova Scotia, who is mentioned in Dr. Waldron's book, There's Something in the Water, they say community members have experienced worsening health since the first generation landfill that was placed in their community in 1974, including increased rates of cancer and diabetes. This person says, if you look at the health of the community prior to 1974, before the landfill site was located in our community seemed to be healthier. From 1974 on till the present day, we noticed our people's health seems to be going downhill. Our people seem to be passing on at a younger age. They're contracting different types of cancer that we never heard of prior to 1974. Stomach cancer seems to be on the rise. Our people end up with tumors in their bodies. And we're at a loss of, what's causing it. The municipality says there's no way that it's the landfill that's affecting us, but if the landfill site located in other areas is having an effect on people's health, shouldn't it be the landfill site located next to our community that's having an impact on our health too? Mr. Speaker, perhaps no other African Canadian community has served as more of a classic example and symbol of both gentrification and environmental racism than Africville, the former Black community on the shores of the Bedford Basin. By 1965, the city of Halifax embarked on an urban renewal campaign resulting in the forcible displacement of its residents, resulting in the area becoming the host for a number of environmental and social hazards, such as a fertilizer plant, a slaughterhouse, a tar factory, a stone and coal crushing plant, a cotton factory, a prison, 3 systems of railway tracks, and an open dump. Mr. Speaker, I ask that all members of the House support this bill. Let's be a first. Let's make this something we can all be proud of, and let's do this for the people of Canada. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I see that there's a lot of interest in questions and comments, so I'm going to ask honourable members to keep their interventions to no more than 45 seconds. Same for the honourable member who's responding. And we'll now go to questions and comments. The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I certainly appreciate that the members brought in a bill to this place and a debate that she's very passionate about. In this bill, she's actually tasking the Minister of Environment, but many of the issues she has talked about are regarding to Indigenous reconciliation, etc. Why only the Minister of the Environment? Why does the member believe that the minister may criticize many of the failures this government has had in reconciliation? Many of these are also historic wrongs dating back to the last century, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to hear what the member has to say in regards to those, and I look forward to the rest of the debate.
The honourable member for Cumberland Colchester.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I'd really like to thank the member for his question. You know, I believe that when I first started down this road researching it, I just thought of it as a provincial issue. A lot of things that are provincial, and municipal, like dumps, waste sites, toxic landfills, things like this. But as I started to look into it more, I started to notice that it is stretched right across Canada. In fact, there are many corporate polluters, which is part of the reason why many Indigenous communities don't have clean drinking water today, and why children have rashes, and why they're having all kinds of illnesses, and why our government is now tasked with cleaning that up. So, yes, I think it will stretch across all kinds of departments, but it lands at the Department of Environment to begin with.
Okay. Questions or comments? Questions et commentaires par conférence virtuelle. La députée de Victoria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the member from Cumberland Colchester for bringing forward this really important bill. I just applaud her work on it. And I'm curious about reparations. This bill speaks about the impacts on Indigenous communities, on racialized communities, and we were just debating a bill on Emancipation Day, and I think the conversation around how to compensate communities who have been impacted is an important one. I'm curious how the member sees her bill fitting into a conversation around reparations.
Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, thank you so much to the member opposite. And I know that you have also she has also studied environmental racism and actually taught about it in university. You know, I think that this is an important part of this bill. We are talking about this now in Nova Scotia, the Black community. It's a very big deal here, and the dialogue has just started. But this bill is meant to be able to get people to make references and tell the government what they think that we should do. And I would hope that the government will then follow suit and take note of that and follow up with it. I think it's very important at this time.
Questions and comments, again by video conference. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do want to thank the honourable member for Cumberland Colchester for bringing forward Bill C-230. It's an honour for me to second it, and of course, she and I originally, my home was originally in Nova Scotia, and it was my first experience of understanding environmental racism was the horrors of the Sydney tar ponds in industrial Cape Breton. They're now sort of cleaned up; they're at least buried, but flagging that was what was called the tar ponds was originally an estuary of a Mi'kmaq fishing grounds where they were forced off that land and put in Member 2 in order to build a steel mill and a coke oven, and the only African Black community in Cape Breton was between the coke ovens and the steel mill. So the population had huge levels of cancer. It was the biggest toxic waste site in Canada. And I wish we'd had that bill, the bill here. I wish we had it in place then. And I just ask the honourable member if she has any reflections on that, and thank her again.
Honourable member for Cumberland Colchester.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you so much again for seconding my bill. You know, it's a perfect example, and so was Boat Harbor. It was a beautiful, pristine lagoon where First Nations communities came to picnic for thousands of years, thousands. And I went there and I saw the degradation and smelt the stink and saw what it was doing to the people. And many of the people that I stood in a barricade with against the mill at that time are no longer here. They died of cancer. So it is a bill whose time has come, and I think it's up to us to make sure that this happens. And I thank you again.
We are out of time, but I'm going to just take some liberties here and take one more question. The honourable member for Sydney, Victoria.
I'd like to start off by thanking the honourable member for her comments, and I'd like to thank the member for her strong leadership and commitment to social justice on this file. As a Mi'kmaq from Nova Scotia, I learned numerous times during my research where Indigenous people were displaced from their traditional lands, often close to their resources in lucrative areas, and centralized onto small reserves in areas that led them to be vulnerable and open to exploitation. My question is, how do you see your bill being able to create the important awareness around these injustices? And do you feel education is an important part of this bill moving forward? Thank you.
Honourable member for Cumberland Colchester.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague because he has done a lot with treaty education in Nova Scotia, and I believe that is something we need to roll out right across this country. People don't seem to understand that the First Nations people were here for 13,000 years before we ever got here. And sometimes when I hear people say, go back to where you came from, pick up your tents and go back to where you came from, it just breaks my heart. And I feel that this kind of bill starts the dialogue and opens people's eyes and hearts to what has been going on for far too long. And I believe it's up to us to fix it. Thank you.